War is not only noble uprisings, heroes dying for their homeland, the unimaginable suffering of innocent bystanders and armed struggle to defend the freedom and dignity of people. War is also, or perhaps above all, a test of character and conscience, behind-the-scenes games of rulers, negotiations, secrets, and betrayal. People, guided by the survival instinct, can do unimaginable things. In the face of death, some individuals will not hesitate to renounce their loved ones, and in extreme cases, fooled by empty promises, are willing to sacrifice their lives. Heroes will show up in difficult times. Such heroism, however, can be wasted when, along with the blood that soaks into the ground, any sense of heroism disappears. Heroism and devotion, as well as collaboration, are two inseparable sides of the same coin. The Germans, despite their belief in the superiority of their race, surprisingly often used collaborators in their actions. Formally, they were enemies, be it racial or ideological. Clearly, the sight of a black Wehrmacht soldier was something rather unusual, but single cases also occurred amongst German troops, if the odds were favorable. Not much is said about the fact that up to 150,000 people, who according to German laws, were considered Jews, or perhaps people of at least partial Jewish origin, who then fought in the Wehrmacht. For many, it was the only option to survive, hiding their origin. But there were also those who declared their zealous dedication to the cause of Nazism, although, of course, rather excluding anti-Semitism. The participation of foreigners in the armed forces of the Third Reich in all support surfaces was much larger than it may seem. Also, Slavic countries were not free from collaborators and people who were forced into the Nazi army. Even citizens of neutral countries, Swiss, Spanish, or Swedish, were sent to the Wehrmacht for various reasons. Some in search of benefits, some fleeing from punishment for their offenses. Occupation in the West was significantly different from that on the Eastern Front. The Western regime was milder, and the situation seemed more acceptable. There were no devastating battles and no mass murder. As a result, the Nazi propaganda was sown on a much more fertile soil. Because people in the West often did not clearly feel the negative effects of occupation as much as, for example, Poles or the Balkan nations. And so tens of thousands of Belgians, Dutchmen, and Frenchmen, often at their own will, found themselves in the German army, encouraged by an extremely efficient Nazi propaganda machine. The unit of the latter, belonging to the Charlemagne Assault Battalion, faithfully defended Berlin and Hitler's bunker against the invading Soviet forces to the very end. While the population of Western countries, through propaganda, could decide whether to support the activities of the Wehrmacht, for many Eastern residents it was only one way to go: collaboration or death. There were also captured Red Army soldiers in the Nazi army, as well as repressed citizens of the USSR who found it easier to decide to cooperate with the enemy. Such a scenario was definitely better for them than death in a prisoner of war camp. Lithuanians, Latvians, Ukrainians. There were many collaborators among these nationalities, often repressed so much by their own state that they were pushed to the full support of the Nazi cause, hoping to improve the quality of their very hard life. Such collaborators often turned out to be extremely ruthless in their actions. There were also Czechs, or finally Poles, of whom almost 500,000 went to the Wehrmacht. Those who had German citizenship before the war, or in order to avoid repression, signed up for the Volkslist, were subject to enforced enlistment, which in turn turned out to be a death sentence on the part of the Soviet Union after the war. After all, Poland is proud of the fact that it was one of the few occupied territories in which volunteer SS units could not be created, but that does not mean there were no collaborators. Fear for one's own life, uncertainty, and a deep sense of injustice always create favorable conditions for trying to improve one's fate by siding with the enemy. Collaboration is not just the army, dramas of insignificant individuals, and the decisions of the repressed people. Collaboration is also governments, high positions, handshakes, and consultations at the highest political levels. There was never a lack of opportunists amongst the rulers. They tried to build their positions and political capital on human tragedies, creating puppet governments directly subordinated to the rule of the Third Reich. When people were passing through hell in concentration camps, receptions to honor the invader were held in palaces. In Europe, there was no shortage of those willing to rule in the country under Hitler's leadership. Vichy in France, Kisling in Norway, Arrow Cross in Hungary, Creations I WAR. These are only some of the groups which successfully decided to cooperate with the Nazis. However, such activities were not always successful. Germany, especially at the end of the war, sought support wherever they could. The purity of the breed moved into the background when the situation on the front became more and more dramatic, and each additional unit allowed to strengthen the hope of winning or simply surviving. Regardless of nationality, there were people everywhere who were ready to fight. There were people everywhere who were ready to side with the enemy for the slightest benefit. On the other hand, there were also people ready to sacrifice their lives for the nation, the cause, all their loved ones, even for the purity of their conscience. After all, there were also collaborators among the Germans themselves, although this is very easy to forget.